Chapter, the city-states. So now we're going to move on to the more specifics about different cities. In particular, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about Sparta, Athens. So one thing to remember that they had the same language and customs and beliefs, but they were separated by the mountains and by the sea also. Section 1, the Polis. Now, the Polis is city-state. Another way of referring to that was the Polis. And it was the center of political and geographic life. It started as villages to defend a hill called Acropolis. This is probably the most famous Acropolis, which is the one in Athens. You can see it's on a rocky outcropping. And there was a temple to a local god on top of the Acropolis. In this case here, it would be Athens. There's a marketplace called an agora at the bottom of the hill. Gradually, these villages became larger and larger until they were cities. Each city-state had its own laws and government, and citizens and slaves and women and children and foreigners and slaves did not count as citizens. People could vote, hold office, own property, and speak in court. And if you weren't a citizen, you didn't have those rights. And again, if you look here, where's my little, there we go. Look over here, it's the Peloponnesus, and if you look closer, you can see Sparta, and then over here we have Athens, this area here. So those are two of the more famous ones. There's some other ones like Thebes and different things like that as well. So citizens were expected to defend the polis during a time of war and to take part in the government. Polis was very important, and this was and they were very different as well across Greece. Sparta, yes, as this guy here, King Leonidas would say, this is Sparta. Pointing right there. Sparta was in the southern part of Greece on the Peloponnesus, and the Peloponnesus was just a big peninsula that kind of jutted out and was narrowly connected to the rest of Greece. Sparta was ruled by aristocrats first, and only aristocrats were citizens, and they served in the assembly that made laws and military policy. Now the ephors trained the young Spartans, and they served public affairs as well. These were the older guys, counselors of elders as well. They were even older. They were older Spartans, and they suggested laws and served as a court. Now, the Spartans did have some issues with other people. The land was farmed by who were slaves owned by the citizens, and basically the merchants or artisans were called Perioeci, and they were the business people of Sparta. And basically, the aristocrats let these groups do their jobs while they mainly trained for war. So they were not interested in trading, they were just interested in training for war. Despite being greatly outnumbered, the aristocrats treated the other groups very harshly, instead of letting them share power. There's even cases, this an image of a helot, and it's possible that they were even outnumbered like to one or even more. So if the Helots had ever risen up, they probably would have had some serious problems. But and that did periodically happen, but they were able to push them back down again because they were so well trained. So if we move on, this is Spartan Way of Life. At the age of 7, boys started to go to military school and train until 60. Spartan men could marry, but they still lived in the military barracks most of the time. Spartan women had more freedom than other city-states as well. This here is a famous helmet, or famous style of helmet. You get the just being able to see through the eyes, the nose bridge, and everything like that. And they would have greaves on their ankles, which would protect their ankles in the front, and a bronze breastplate as well. So they were pretty well protected for the time being. In other city-states, women were not allowed to go out without chaperones and did very few things outside the home, but Spartan women were allowed to go out and freely watch things like the sports. You weren't even allowed to watch the Olympics if you were a woman. Spartans tried to prevent change because they were worried it would destroy their way of militarily strong, remained poor because it did not address the needs of most of its people. Now I come to Athens, and Athens is what most people think of when they think of Greece. Again, this is the Acropolis from a different perspective as well. Athens was originally ruled by kings, but nobles, merchants, and manufacturers took over. These groups set what was called an oligarchy, which is ruled by a small group of people. Those in power agreed to make reforms because they were concerned about that people not in power would revolt, so they tried reforms. Draco tried to make some changes, but his punishments were too harsh when you didn't do what he wanted, and that's actually where we get the term draconian, because the punishments were really harsh, and that's what that means. Solon came next, and he set up a constitution, which was a set of principles and rules for governing. And that's a huge deal, because after all, we have a constitution ourselves. This is the name of Solon. Under the first constitution, a person had a right to vote in the assembly only if they had a certain amount of property. And this assembly also passed laws. These changes allowed more people to become a part of the government and also increased trade. Now we have an image of the opening part of our constitution. Solon, yeah, kind of funky hair there. Solon became less popular because both the rich and the poor thought he had not gone far enough, and in either side. So Pisistratus came next, and he was popular with the poor because he divided large estates among them. Again, if you want to make if you want to be popular with the poor, take the rich people's stuff and give that to them, and that definitely will make them happier. After Pisistratus died, then the Spartans briefly overthrew the government of Athens, came in, they were looking for someone to attack always, it seemed, the Spartans. Then Cleisthenes came in as the leader, and he had helped to overthrow the Spartans. And Cleisthenes soon put forth the effect of the first into effect, the democratic constitution. The constitution allowed for free speech, and these reforms lasted for Cleisthenes allowed any over the age of to be of the assembly. The assembly elected 10 generals to be in charge of the army, the navy, and to serve as chief justices. Now, one of the generals was named commander-in-chief, and there's a council of 500, and that handled most of the Athenian government chores. This is an image of that. And members of this council were chosen randomly from the citizens. They could only serve 2 terms. So this helped to make the council representative of the people. Cleisthenes required people to educate their sons in a variety of subjects, and this again is someone being educated here. At the age of 18, boys would take a loyalty oath to Athens. And really important to understand, just going back here for a second here, most of the people are not Athenian citizens, because we still have all these things. They were not considered citizens, and very important to understand. Now, the Persians were the most powerful during the time, and the Persians conquered a lot of a set of islands called Ionia. This is in this region here, and when this was where the Greeks had left to during the Dark Ages. Some of them had headed over there, so it considered to be a part of Greece. And when the Ionians revolted against Persia, they asked for help from the Greeks. Athens helped a little, but the Persians did win, and the Persians kept that in mind. The Persian leader Darius was then determined to punish the Greeks, because basically he said, you know what, you're not gonna go ahead and stand up to me and get away. So he sent a lot of ships, and it's called Marathon, in an attempt to invade Greece, but they lost the battle there and did not continue. This is kind of a famous sort of idea here. The Greek center goes ahead and pushes forth, and then on the sides, so it's called a double envelopment. They get them on the sides, and that just is one of those things that you never want to be in a battle where you're enveloped. And here you're enveloped on both sides. Now, Athens found some silver mines, and he spent a lot of money on a new type of ships called triremes. And the Persians under Darius' son Xerxes invaded Greece another time, and they basically won northern Greece. The remaining Greek city-states joined forces, with Athens leading the navy and Sparta leading the army. And the Spartan troops fought the Persians at a mountain pass called Thermopylae, but eventually did lose. This is the famous 300, where we get the movie 300 from, which is totally ridiculous in most ways, but it does set up an idea where it was the Persians that the Greeks were fighting. The Persians eventually got to Athens, but the people then had evacuated it, so the Persians burned it to the ground. The Persians then lost a major battle at a place called Salamis because their ships were not as maneuverable as the triremes. And again, the whole idea was you had some sails here. These rows you would push forth with these, and you try and get to a ramming speed. And this was a prow that would hopefully like hit below the water line, and then if you hit below the water line, the other people's ships would sink. Persians lost a battle, and their remaining troops did not come back, and really not particularly good for the Persians. the Delian League in the Athenian Empire, the Greeks were still worried about the Persians, so they formed a defensive league that would protect them. It was headquartered in a place called Delos, so it was called the Delian League, and this is from the island of Delos today. It's an amphitheater, I believe. And once the city-state joined, they could not leave unless everybody agreed to. The ships for the league were built and manned by the Athenians and funded by the other city-states. And the Athenians took advantage of it and of its control over the sea, and the Delian League basically became an Athenian empire. And you can kind of see this whole idea, this yellow area, that the Athenians ended up controlling over time. The leader during this time was a guy named Pericles. He helped by to make Athens beautiful by rebuilding its palaces and temples after the Persians had destroyed a lot of it. And the other city-states sort of resented Athens' power, but they were still worried about the Persians. Athens attacked one of Sparta's allies, so Sparta declared war on Athens, and this led to something called the Peloponnesian War, which was not good for Greece. It lasted for about 30 years, and eventually Athens loses to Sparta. Again, you can see kind of the idea over here, the different groups that this fall into. We have the greens that are neutral, and then the orange ones are the ones that are Athens and its allies, and then over here the yellow are the Spartans and their allies. You can see here also, this is why this is called the Peloponnesus, because it's only linked very smallly by a small strip of land. Now, disease and the war led to the decline of Athens. Actually, Pericles, he contracted a disease. There was a plague going around as well. And young men started to become mercenaries, hired soldiers in the Persian army instead of actually serving with the Athenian army. Athens kicked out the Spartans, but the sea-state was never really the same after the war. And in section 4, we're going to talk about how the decline of the sea-states. Now, this is how Athens looked around in the 5th century BC, but this really fell apart over time because people started to feel less tied down to these city-states. People became more interested in themselves than helping out their polis due to the long war, and a great deal of money had been wasted and spent on it. People in different social classes started to become bitter towards each other as well, or at least more bitter. After the war, Sparta ruled Greece harshly, and people did not like it. A group led by the city-states of Thebes overthrew Sparta, but things were not any better. The fighting made the Greeks relatively weak and not united. And then we get Philip II of Macedon coming in from the north of Greece, and he invaded and he took over, and that really leads to the end of the Greek city-states and the start of the empire of Alexander the Great. And that is it.